Come, my love, and walk with me by the river so free. The sun will set, the moon will rise. Love is the wonder of the night. Feel the breeze through autumn leaves. See the stars.
Hello, I'm Joe Narusiewicz. Welcome to the St. Croix River, a river of dreams. The historic St. Croix River has its origin in Solon Springs, Wisconsin, at Lake St. Croix, where it flows south approximately 165 miles to meet the Mississippi River down by Prescott, Wisconsin. The first 38 miles of the St. Croix River flows strictly in the state of Wisconsin. Then by Danbury, Wisconsin, it becomes a border river for the next 127 miles, flowing between the states of Wisconsin and Minnesota. The St. Croix River can be divided into two sections. The upper St. Croix, going from Solon Springs to a Great Falls, where there are two cities on either side of the river. St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, and Taylor Falls, Minnesota. South of these falls is the last section of the river, flowing 50 miles, known as the Lower St. Croix. The Lower St. Croix is more abundant in population and has more cities. Stillwater being the largest city on the Minnesota side, Hudson being the largest on the Wisconsin side. The St. Croix River had various names. Father Hennepin called it the River of the Grave. In 1680, this book was published, but it never became known as the St. Croix River until the year 1689, when a French explorer, Nicolas Perrot, named it in a proclamation. This proclamation, calling all the lands there for France, was signed also by Pierre Charles Lesueur. St. Croix means Holy Cross. Why the river is named after this, we do not know for certain. Daniel Gray Solon Lesueur Duluth first went down the river in 1679 and is given credit for being the first European to go down the river. He mentions later in his writings a Sieur de la Croix. One of the explorer Lesueur's party members mentions a French trader named St. Croix who wrecked his boat near the joining of the St. Croix with the Mississippi. Many think that this is why the St. Croix is named, in memory of this man's tragic death. Later, other reasons begin to crop up why the St. Croix was named such, like the rocks at the dells that resemble a cross, but these are really not substantiated. The purpose of this film is to bring out some of the beauty of the river and show some of its illustrious history. The fur trade, the logging era, pioneer settlement, and what is going on with the river today. We'll start out with the National Park Service, which has jurisdiction over the river along with the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin, their various counties, cities, and townships. The Wild and Scenic River Act was passed in 1968, signed into law by President Johnson, making the St. Croix River and the Namakagon River protected waterways. In 1972, the Lower St. Croix was added.
The St. Croix National Scenic Riverway is part of your national park system. When the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed, it was not a local idea. We talk about Mondale being a senator from Minnesota, Nelson being a senator from Wisconsin, but this had to go through the U.S. Congress.
It was actually the citizens of the states of Wisconsin and Minnesota that brought to the attention of the federal government the need to preserve this river.
There was an increasing awareness at the time, the 1960s, that we were losing some valuable resources. We were losing plant life. We were losing wildlife. Species such as the bald eagles were declining and on the endangered species list.
We are now finding an increase in the number of eagles. In fact, there are probably more eagles on the St. Croix and Namakagon River now than there ever have been. The ospreys have returned, the trumpeter swans have returned, and many other species as well.
The riverway is 252 miles of water, including one of the St. Croix's major tributaries, the Namakagon River.
I see an America whose rivers and valleys and lakes, hills and streams and plains, the mountains over our land, and nature's wealth deep under the earth are protected as the rightful heritage of all the people. Franklin D. Roosevelt. If the St. Croix had not been one of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Acts, I think what we would be seeing today is tons of condominiums, lots of boat slips.
In the end, our society will be defined not only by what we create, but by what we refuse to destroy. John Sawhill.
In a country where nature has been so lavish and where we have been so spendthrift of indigenous beauty, to set aside a few rivers in their natural state should be considered an obligation. Senator Frank Church from Idaho.
The actual river valley itself was carved by a tremendous outflow of water approximately 10,000 years ago, coming out of ancient Lake Duluth, which occupied the area of present Lake Superior. This glacial meltwater rushed down this valley and carved its unique features.
The St. Croix watershed is about 7,650 square miles. Its elevation is 1,015 feet at the source, 675 feet above sea level at the mouth. The overall drop is 340 feet, with an average gradient of about 2 feet per mile.
One of the unique things about the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway is its geology. We are actually standing among rocks that are over 1.1 billion years old. They are among some of the oldest rocks exposed anywhere on the surface in the upper Midwest.
In an average year, about 139 trillion gallons of water flow past St. Croix Falls.
Hello, I'm Bill Anderson, Park Manager of Minnesota's William O'Brien State Park. In Minnesota, along the St. Croix River, there are 5 state parks. From north to south, the parks are St. Croix, Wild River, Interstate, William O'Brien, and Afton. In Wisconsin, there are 3 state parks along the St. Croix River: Wisconsin Interstate, Willow River, and Kinnickinnick.
The St. Croix National Scenic Riverway includes 1 national forest, 3 state forests, 6 scientific natural areas, and 6 wildlife refuges.
The St. Croix has 11 major tributaries flowing into it, the first being the Namakagon River, approximately 28 miles down on the Wisconsin side. This is the largest volume of water flowing into the St. Croix. Then we have the Yellow River, the Clam River, the Kettle River. Here the St. Croix broadens. The Snake River, the Wood River, the Trade River, finally the Sunrise River on the upper St. Croix. The rivers on the lower St. Croix are the Apple River, the Willow River, and finally the Kinnickinnick River. Many of these tributaries would be used by the fur trade, and during the logging era, the St. Croix River would become over an 800-mile system.
The riverway contains more than 60 state and federally listed endangered and threatened species.
We have 40 species of freshwater mussels. And to give you an idea of what that number means, in all of Europe, in all of the rivers of Europe, there are 12 species of freshwater mussels. In all of the rivers of Africa, there are 15 species of freshwater mussels. Freshwater mussels are important to our riverway because they are filter feeders. They spend 24 hours, 7 days a week, filtering the water so that all the other aquatic insects and species in the riverway can have a clean, healthy neighborhood to live in. The St. Croix has 2 species of freshwater mussels that are federally endangered. The first one, the winged maple leaf, is actually The St. Croix is the last place in the entire world where that particular species is still thriving and still having young. The second species is the Higgins eye pearly, and the St. Croix is the last known place where they are still having young and they are not threatened by an exotic species known as the zebra mussels. The good news is zebra mussels are not in the majority of the St. Croix at this time. So in order to prevent introducing zebra mussels into clean waterways, it's important to clean your boat off or keep it out of the water before you introduce it into a clean waterway.
The two Native American tribes that were living primarily in this area were the Ojibwe and the Dakota. The Ojibwe were descended from earlier tribes out east in the eastern part of the country, and they were pushed westward by the European settlers that moved onto this continent. And as they pushed westward, they were moving the Dakota from the woodlands down to the plains. As the Ojibwe Native Americans moved into this area, into the Dakota Territory, they were clashing with them. The Taylors Falls, St. Croix Falls area was the site of a great battle, primarily between the Ojibwe and the Dakota.
In 1713, De Rousseau and his cousin were trading on the Snake River with the Dakota Indians. 100 years later, you would find traders amongst the Ojibwe.
Starting in the early 1820s, Fort Snelling became more of an area where Native people were coming to meet with the agency, and the agent was mediating disputes between the Ojibwe and the Dakota.
For centuries, Native Americans were establishing trade routes through waterways and trails. Some of these would become major roads and eventually even highways.
There was a French fur trader explorer by the name of Daniel Greysolon, the Sieur du Luth, who came from Montreal through the Great Lakes to the point of Lake Superior, which is now known as the city of Duluth. He met up with some Ojibwe Native Americans in that area, and they told him of twin streams joined by a carrying place or a portage.
The fur traders coming into this part of the world, and actually the Native Americans for hundreds, if not thousands of years prior to the Europeans coming, would travel Lake Superior, come up the Brule River, portage over to the St. Croix and down the St. Croix.
The Brule and St. Croix rivers provide the shortest natural water highway between Lake Superior and the upper Mississippi. Daniel Greysolon, Sieur de Luth, in 1680 was the first white man to use this passage. The city of Duluth, Minnesota, north of here, was named after Daniel Greysolon, Sieur de Luth, as is the local town of Solon Springs, which is some 35 miles south of Duluth.
The fur trade was here before we were a United States and would march right through our early history. England and France were competing for the land, and companies were competing for the valuable, abundant furs in our region. The St. Croix Waterway has two reconstructed posts. One is on the Snake River on the Minnesota side, another, the Yellow River, on the Wisconsin side. Both these posts used the St. Croix to the Brule to get to Lake Superior to bring their furs up to Grand Portage, a major trading post located on the Minnesota side on the Canadian border along Lake Superior. Grand Portage itself is a reconstructed trading post. It was well established in the 1700s and thrived until the early 1800s.
Not only do we have excellent archaeological records for both the Yellow River and the Snake River posts, there were journals kept by traders at both sites. We have John Sayers' journal at the Snake River. We also have Michel Cureau's journal kept at the Yellow River, as well as a reminiscence written by George Nelson about 30 years after he wintered on the Yellow River.
The fur trade in the early 19th century was their equivalent of the oil industry in the 21st century. It was a huge engine for economic development in North America.
Looking at either the Snake River or the Yellow River post, one gets the mistaken impression that the Northwest Company was just someone's idea to name these two little wintering posts. But actually it was an international concern based in Montreal. The company had over 100 wintering posts throughout North America, from Kings Post on the Atlantic to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and by the end of the first decade of the 19th century, they were across the Rocky Mountains and trading on the Pacific slope. So very large concern, thousands of men employed pursuing the fur trade, and these little outposts make it look like it was a small operation, but it was very far-flung, bringing in trade goods from around the world, teas, silks from China, Calcutta cloth from India, tobacco from South America, rum from the West Indies, ironware from Birmingham, England, muskets, kettles, you name it, it's coming in from around the world. The Northwest Company was based, out of Montreal, but had an inland headquarters at Grand Portage or Grand Portage, Minnesota, up until 1802. But because it was a British company, the U.S. government threatened to set up a customs house to collect taxes. So they found another way to get west using the Kaministiquia River and move their inland headquarters north to Fort William.
In 1805, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike of the 1st Infantry was sent up the Mississippi to look for places for good military establishments, to figure out what the source of the Mississippi was, to meet with the native people, to tell them that they had a new father, the president in Washington, D.C., to meet with the British traders and tell them that the American government would like them to move across the international border. And in late September of 1805, he came here to the junction of the Mississippi and the Minnesota River and conducted 2 days worth of conferences with local Dakota chiefs and arranged to buy a military reservation, about 100,000 acres, all of what's downtown Minneapolis, south towards the Minnesota River. Fort Snelling was built to protect and control the American fur trade, to make sure that English traders were not trading south of the international border. It was built to keep peace among the native people. The Dakota and the Ojibwa were longtime enemies, and of course they're the people who really worked the fur trade, and if they were fighting, the trade wasn't going forward. It was also built to keep white settlers out of this area. The land had not been properly ceded to the United States government, and it was the government's policy to keep white settlers off of unceded land. Native people in this area were strongly tied to the British through their Indian agents and through the British traders, and so one of the reasons the fort was established was to attach the Indians to the Americans by having an Indian agent here and by protecting the fur trade commerce of the American Fur Company and the Columbia Fur Company.
Many people have the impression that these Europeans were coming out, setting up these posts, and then going out and hunting the game. In reality, it was the Native Americans who were hunting the game. Native women were processing all the hides. It was really a fur trade. Europeans were bringing out goods manufactured basically around the world, and then taking those furs back east and continuing that cycle year after year.
The fur trade company worked on a credit system. During the fall, fur traders extended credit to Indians based on their history and how well they thought they would do in the winter hunt. In the spring, when it came time to settle their accounts, the Indians usually ended up in debt to the company.
The Northwest Company in the Upper St. Croix, actually wherever it was in operation, one could consider it establishing convenience stores amongst the native peoples. And in the upper St. Croix, you had posts on the Yellow River, the Namaquagan, the Snake River, the Clam River. So they were within 20 miles radius. You could come across another trading post. One tributary of the St. Croix, the Kettle, was actually had a XY Company trading post on it, which the XY Company merged with the Northwest Company in the fall of 1804.
In 1802 and 1803, in the Danbury area on the Yellow River, two competing fur trading companies built forts. In 1803 and 1804, conflict between the Ojibwe and Dakota tribes forced the XY and the Northwest Companies to merge, forming what is now known as Fort Faulavon.
The Yellow River Post was built in 1802, and the Snake River Post was built in 1804. Not only were they Northwest Company posts, but they have a lot of the personnel who built the post over on the Yellow also came over here in 1804 and built this post. The major impetus for the fur trade, of course, was the beaver. This was made into top hats for the heads of fashionable Europeans. But the traders took other furs as well. All the furs that, or all the animals that you can find in the wilderness would find their way to the trading post and to Europe.
Well, my name is Mary. I work here at the Northwest Company Fur Post here on the Snake River. I'm also known as Beneque, Partridge Woman. I portray a mixed blood woman, French and Ojibwe, and my important task here at the post is to relate the women's side of the story, because without the women there wouldn't be a fur trade. The mixed blood women, the Indian women, took care of the babies and the sick people, the old people. They tanned the hides, the deer hides, to take to market. They scraped the furs and dried the furs that were being collected by Mr. Sayer and the men. We provided the wild rice, the maple sugar, did the cooking, the cleaning, all the important work. Here on the Snake River and on most of the tributaries of the St. Croix, wild rice was a very important staple. The women, the mixed blood women, gathered the wild rice, and any extra left over after feeding the family was given to the trader or traded to the traders. In fact, this region was so important, it was called the Faulavon, the wild rice region for the Northwest Company. In the fur trade, the Northwest Company and the voyageurs quickly adapted to the material culture of the Indian people. They quickly began using the toboggan. They used the sleds, the dog sleds, the snowshoes, the canoe, of course. And they adapted the dress of the Indian people because that's the most practical thing for this part of the country. The moccasins, the leggings, the capot, the blanket coat, all things from the native culture.
We had the smaller canoe, but they adapted it and made the much larger North canoe and the Montreal canoe to accommodate their heavy cargo that they would bring here to trade.
The voyageurs were the working class men of the fur trade. They were really the muscle. They're the men who paddled the canoes. They're the men who carried all the baggage across the portage trails. They're the ones who erected the trading posts once they arrived. They were also responsible for the maintenance of the bark canoes. Birch bark canoes originally were invented by Native Americans, but it proved to be the best vessel for carrying thousands of pounds of merchandise out into the interior. And of course, for generating a lot of sweat on the brows of voyageurs.
Think about going up this river. This is the calmest part of the whole river. We're going to be fighting current the whole way, mostly poling or wading the canoe up. And 4 hours up the river, we've got Kekabeka Falls. They call this the mountain portage, and it's just one of dozens of portages along this river. Voyageurs' life expectancy is about 40 years. Most of us dying from hernias, from trying to lift too much weight because we get paid more if we can carry more weight on a portage.
The Indians taught the voyageurs to put their canoes underwater for the wintertime so that they wouldn't dry out and it'd be nice and moist for the spring when they were transporting their furs back down the river.
The design that we took was from the natives, the Ojibwe. So we took the design. They would have a normal 15-foot hunter canoe, and basically we took it and made it larger into a 24-foot north canoe. So mostly women were doing all the pitching and the spruce root sewing on the canoes, while I myself, a canoe builder, would be doing all the woodwork on the inside.
A Montreal canoe can actually hold about 8,000 pounds worth of goods.
The Montreal canoe is 36 feet long.
The Northwest Fur Company used the Snake River specifically for transporting their furs to the St. Croix. From the St. Croix, they went to Solon Springs, to the Brule, into Lake Superior, and then on to Grand Portage.
To the prosperity of the Northwest Company! Here! To voyageurs, their wives and families!
We are at the center of a vast empire which stretches from London, England, to Canton, China, to this great land of lakes and forests.
Even though the American Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 gave the United States clear title to this land, they had no military presence in the area to back up their claim. So British fur traders and all of the Indians in the area continued to send their furs to profit British fur trade companies and not the United States. John Jacob Astor was the owner of the American Fur Company and had already made millions of dollars from the fur trade business after the Revolutionary War. Astor was a powerful political figure. He wielded great power in the United States Congress and lobbied heavily for the American government to remove British fur traders from the West. The competition between the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company was spiraling out of control. Both companies were building fur posts and putting in trading posts any place they thought they could find business. John Jacob Astor and the United States government recognized the danger of allowing this competition to go on without any check, and knew they needed to build forts in the West to kick the British fur traders out. During the War of 1812, the British forces in the West consisted of Canadian militia, which was mainly made up of fur trade employees, and their Indian allies. These forces defeated the United States Army every time they fought them in the West. During the War of 1812, this is the far western border of the United States. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, returned the boundaries to exactly where they had been before the War of 1812. Had the treaty not returned the boundaries to their original locations, a good portion of Minnesota and part of Wisconsin would probably have been in Canadian hands. During the War of 1812, the British invaded Prairie du Chien and took over the American fort and burned it. After the War of 1812, the United States rebuilt the fort and called it Fort Crawford.
To get goods in and furs out, the American Fur Company and others used the Great Lakes route. In our region, in would be Green Bay to the Fox River or Short Portage to the Wisconsin River to Prairie du Chien on the Mississippi that could go either way.
Later on, fur trade companies such as the Columbia Fur Company chose to use the Mississippi River to take their goods directly to St. Louis and New Orleans to get them out of the United States.
The American Fur Company is a New York company, and they want goods traded in the fur trade built in the United States.
During the American period, beavers are no longer abundant in this area. However, muskrats are being harvested by the thousands and are considered the currency of the fur trade. Prairie du Chien on the Wisconsin side of the Mississippi River was also the hub of the American Fur Company in the West during this period. The Monroe Doctrine reinforced the Treaty of Ghent by seeking the removal of British fur trade companies from the West.
The Northwest Company continued to trade in this region until 1818.
Fort Snelling was never attacked by Indians. Its job was to keep the peace, and it did that pretty effectively. Fort Snelling's reach went all the way from Wabasha's village south on the Mississippi River to the Red River of the north and the west to the American-Canadian border in the north. Covered hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory by simply having a fort at the junction of the Minnesota and the Mississippi River.
The Native Americans sided with the British companies in the fur trade. To break this bond, President Jefferson had a plan, and he said, "We shall push our trading houses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run into debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by giving up their lands." James Madison served as Secretary of State under Jefferson, and he became the next president and signed the declaration of war with Great Britain in the War of 1812. President James Monroe followed Jefferson's policy. He appointed John C. Calhoun as Secretary of War. In Calhoun's own words, he wrote, "It is believed with judicious contact on the part of our officers that our northwestern frontier will be rendered much more secure than before, and that the most valuable fur trade in the world will be thrown into our hands." In 1808, President Jefferson urged the Senate to ratify the Zebulon-Pike Treaty. In a letter, Pike had said, 100,000 acres for a song. William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame wrote in 1804 and 5 that certain posts should be put on prime waterways. President Jefferson read this and he agreed, and 2 posts would be built in our area. One, Prairie du Chien, along the Mississippi and the Wisconsin rivers. The other, Fort Snelling, started in 1819 and 1820. Josiah Snelling became commander. The fort became named after him in what was then St. Peter's.
John Jacob Astor realized that the fur trade business was dying and sold out his business interests to smaller agents such as Henry Sibley in the 1830s.
Henry Sibley came to St. Peter's in 1835 as the factor for the American Fur Company's post across the river from Fort Snelling at Mendota, and that was his chief form of livelihood from 1835 into the 1840s. Lawrence Tolliver, the Indian agent at Fort Snelling, was extremely influential not only with the Dakota of the Minnesota River Valley, but also the Ojibwa of the Upper Mississippi and the St. Croix. There were constantly people here to see Tolliver, to get his advice, and Tolliver was very concerned by the late 1830s that the Indians were going to get rubbed out by American settlement and farmers and so forth. And he helped negotiate the Treaty of 1837, which ceded all the land east of the Mississippi to the United States, through his influence with the Ojibwa as well. Fort Snelling went literally overnight in 1838 from being well beyond the line of settlement to right the very edge of the frontier, and immediately land speculators and timber speculators started coming into the area to travel up the St. Croix River to establish claims and harvest timber in that rich area. This is called the Treaty of 1837 or the Treaty of Washington. The Treaty of 1837 was ratified here at Fort Snelling in 1838. Commissioners came to pay the Indians their first annuity and to get their signatures.
Just like the beaver or the muskrat, alcohol and liquor were important factors in the fur trade. Everyone knew the key to controlling the Indian trade was controlling the liquor. The United States government outlawed the sale of alcohol by the fur trade companies in order to become the only supplier. The waning of the fur trade in the St. Croix River Valley was the boom of the timber trade. By the time of the treaty, the Ojibwa and Dakota both owed money to the United States government and the fur traders. By law, only the United States government could buy land from American Indians. The United States government purchased the land in the St. Croix River Valley with the intention that it would be used for logging and settlement. The land west of the Mississippi was still considered prime fur trade land. By the late 1840s, the fur trade in the region had collapsed. The only thing the American Indians had left to sell was their land. As a consequence, in 1851, they signed the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, which gave them reservation land, goods and services, and money in exchange for the bulk of their land in what became the state of Minnesota.
The Northwest Company and the Ojibwe culture were a very amicable relationship. And the Northwest Company did not try to change our traditional lifestyle of hunting, gathering, of harvesting maple sugar and wild rice, but they did want us to accept the convenience of European technology.
Both Lawrence Tolliver and Henry Sibley were very sympathetic to Native people. They both had Indian wives, they had Indian children. They were very worried that Native culture was going to be completely exterminated by the tide of European Americans' settlement.
Jefferson had said, govern the Indians by commerce rather than by arms. This worked. Becoming dependent upon the fur trade, becoming indebted to the U.S. government, the Native Americans were willing to give up their lands. The U.S. government had succeeded in getting the Native Americans away from the Northwest and Hudson Bay companies. The Treaty of 1837 opened up a new chapter in our history and in the St. Croix history. Now, logging, agriculture, and settlement were about to arrive.
From the very beginning, steamboats played a major role in the development and settlement of the St. Croix Valley. In 1838, the Palmyra came up the Mississippi from St. Louis, went first to Fort Snelling, and then came to the St. Croix River. With 50 men aboard, Calvin A. Tuttle, millwright, and Levi W. Stratton headed a crew of millwrights, carpenters, masons, lumbermen, teamsters, and laborers. On the Palmyra were provisions for 4 months, and the tools and machinery to build a sawmill and shops.
This would become St. Croix Falls Lumber Company, organized by Franklin Steele, Henry Sibley's brother-in-law. Steele accepted another job with Fort Snelling, and the organization never did get on the right track. The sawmill would not open up until 1842. This area would develop into St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin. Maureen on the St. Croix on the Minnesota side had the oldest sawmill. This was opened up August 24th, 1839. This was the first mill to export out of the region using the St. Croix and the Mississippi rivers. This company is called the Marine Lumber Company. 12 men from Marine, Illinois would start the company, but Orange Walker would come to Marine and build a sawmill within 90 days and emerge as the head boss. Through hard times and hard work, the company would prosper, and in the mid-1840s would build a store. It also established a lumber yard in St. Louis, Missouri, under the direction of George B. Judd.
Marine on the St. Croix was incorporated in 1838, and the general store was started in 1865. When I was 13, I used to put my boat in right here and go 12 miles downriver to school in Stillwater, Minnesota. What a great way to go to school as a kid.
Today, Marine on St. Croix remains one of the gems of the St. Croix Valley. By 1855, there would be 17 lumbering mills built along the lower St. Croix, from St. Croix Falls to Prescott. States like Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri that had few trees demanded our lumber, and the logging industry along the St. Croix River grew.
The dam in the background
was constructed in the early 1900s and for electrical power generation. And at one time it was one of the major electrical feeders of the Twin Cities.
Taylor's Falls and St. Croix Falls both were called the Falls at St. Croix until 1848, when Wisconsin became a state. When Wisconsin became a state, the west side of the river became known as Taylor's Falls, named after Joshua Taylor, who was also an early warden at Stillwater Prison. Before the Great Dam was built, there were natural falls, a series that dropped about 55 feet. Because of this natural barrier, steamboats never did go past these falls. Past these falls became known as the Upper St. Croix, and this is where the great pineries were, along the St. Croix and its tributaries. Many of the businessmen and loggers that would invest in the St. Croix pineries and sawmills came from New England. Many parts of the St. Croix Valley retain this New England flavor. Taylor Falls and the Angels Hill area is a prime example.
I am privileged to live in Taylor's Falls, one of the oldest communities in Minnesota, and we are standing in Angels Hill Historic District, which is a nationally designated area set aside for preservation. Because Taylor's Falls was settled by the New Englanders, that style of architecture followed them to make them feel at home. One feature of the Greek Revival houses here in Taylor's Falls is the glass around the front door. It signifies that it's a Greek Revival house right away.
Hi, my name is Dr. Bill Young, and we're in the Taylor's Falls Methodist Church. This church was built in 1861 with land donated by Mr. Folsom, whose house is right below here. All of the furniture here is original, including the pews, even the organ, which we don't use much anymore. This church has been in constant use as a place of worship since 1861 when it opened, and is the oldest Methodist church in the state of Minnesota.
The Folsom House was built in 1855 and has been lived in by 5 generations of the Folsom family. When Mrs. Folsom first came to the house when it opened in 1855 in May, she first stopped off in St. Louis, Missouri, and bought a brand new set of furniture, the Louis XV Revival that you see here. The piano Mrs. Folsom purchased in Boston in the 1840s, and when they came out here, she had it shipped down the coast to New Orleans and came up the Mississippi and St. Croix by steamboat. The 2 photographs over the piano are of Mary Jane Folsom and W.H.C. Folsom. They were given to them on the occasion of their 50th wedding anniversary in 1891 by their family. Folsoms were staunch Lincoln supporters. The portrait is interesting in that it shows Lincoln when he first became president before he grew the beard. Folsom was involved in just about everything. He had a general store in town here. He was a logger with a number of logging camps in Wisconsin and Minnesota. He was in 5 sessions of the state senate, one of the state legislature, helped write the state constitution, wrote a book. He had a buggy factory here in town, built steamboats that plied the St. Croix, and many, many other activities. Wyman X. Folsom was the oldest son of W.H.C. and Mary Jane, and he went into the Civil War at the age of 17. And in this cabinet we have his Civil War uniform. Notice the dress of Mrs. Folsom, which indicates that she was quite small. She wore this dress for the 50th wedding anniversary in 1891. The desk is that of Mr. Folsom's. He did a lot of his writing and so forth. This was his study. It's interesting that you'll note on the desk is the Taylor's Falls Reporter from April of 1865, which you have to read down halfway down the page to learn in very small print that Abraham Lincoln is dead. That's the actual paper, which was printed in 1865. This is his son Wyman X. Folsom's log mark, which was then pounded on the end of the log as opposed to branded. The builder of the house was Elias Connor, a friend of Folsom's who also came from the state of Maine. He came to Minnesota to build the first bridge ever across any point of the Mississippi, that of the Hennepin Avenue Bridge, suspension bridge. He then went on to build this house in 1854-55 and in 1856, the first bridge across the St. Croix. Little schoolhouse, a block downhill from the Folsom House, was built in 1852 in the Greek Revival style.
The Taylor Falls, St. Croix Falls area was noted for log jams because of the narrowness of the river in that region.
Over 250 million feet of timber was jammed here. Logs were piled as high as the corner rock that we're approaching to our right front. It's about 50 feet high. Then the logs were backed upstream behind us for 7 miles. It took the loggers 6 weeks of their summer using horse teams, steamboats, and eventually dynamite to break this log jam free.
In the early days of logging on the St. Croix, the loggers would use sloughs. They had already stamped or branded their logs. This system became ineffective as logging increased, and the loggers knew that they needed a boom site.
When the lumbermen cut the trees down and got them onto the water, they had to have a place where they could sort and organize the logs. These were called boom sites.
In 1851, 8 men of different companies agreed that they would allow a boom site to be built about 2 miles north of Osceola, and it would be called the Osceola Boom Site. This organization became known as the St. Croix Boom Company. Some of the men who were part of this organization were Folsom of Taylor Falls, Orange Walker and George B. Judd of Marine, William Kent of Osceola, and a rising star, John McCusick of Stillwater. This boom site opened up in 1852, but it became evident soon afterwards with the increase of logging that it was too narrow of an area and a new one would be founded. Isaac Staples came to the St. Croix region in 1853, went back to Maine, convinced his partner Samuel F. Hersey that the area was worth investing in, moved to Stillwater in 1854, started a store and a sawmill. He acquired power in the Osceola Boom Company and said there needed to be another one. He chose an area 2 miles north of Stillwater. Where the St. Croix widens, this would become the major boom site on the St. Croix River for over 50 years. The boom site was approved by many lumbermen along the St. Croix River, among them Martin Maurer from Arcola, who would end up heading this new boom company in the 1880s. In some places they would build dams, especially on the upper St. Croix. This way they could control the logs and the river better.
The cutaway dam was used by logging companies to gather logs, sort and segregate for on their journey down the St. Croix River to the logging mills.
The Gordon Dam, a few miles downstream of Gordon, Wisconsin, not only was used for logging, but it helped create the beautiful St. Croix flowage area. To control the flow of logs coming into the Taylor Falls, St. Croix Falls area, where the river made a sharp right turn bend, the Nevers Dam was built 11 miles upstream in 1890. The St. Croix River is becoming over an 800-mile system with its tributaries.
Most of the white pine were cut in the wintertime because it was easier to skid. The horses had to pull them on a dray, and a lot of times it's more important to have a good landing to put these trees on. And when the rivers freeze over or the lakes, they could skid right out onto the lake and pile them up. And then in the spring when the water melted, they floated them down to the sawmills.
Hopefully the rains come and the logs can be floated down the river. This system meant that there had to be logging camps built, lumberjacks hired, crew foremen, cooks, horses, oxen if necessary, and sleds and tools. In the 1840s and 1850s, there are no trains helping get this lumber, so the horses and sleds are important. Once they put the logs in the water in the spring, crews would actually go down the river. Cook boats, wanigans, rafters. They didn't want their rafts broken up or their logs hung up someplace, so they would actually follow and help guide their investment.
After the fur trade, the Snake River was used for logging. Pine County was established through the logging industry. Pine City was originally called Shangwatana, which is an Ojibwe word for City of Pines. Pine City was moved from the east side of Cross Lake to the west side of Cross Lake in approximately 1860 because of the railroad was going through on the west side of the lake. We're on Cross Lake, where the Snake River goes out of the lake, and they had a boom site where the logs started their journey down the river in the spring. We're on the west side of Cross Lake by the Snake River that runs in here from Lake Pekegama, past the fur post, and the logs followed the same route when they got cut and shipped down. Here we are at the Kettle River, another tributary to the St. Croix River. The Kettle River was used by the fur trade, primarily the XY Company, and later for logging the white pine.
The white pine was ideal for rivers because many times they're shallow, and the white pine is relatively light and buoyant.
Loggers said when they first came into the area that it was the largest stand of white pine that they had seen. It formed a canopy so thick that they could not even see the sky. The white pine was a tree that was coveted by the logging industry. It produced more board feet because of its size than any other tree. Some of the trees that were here were 5 feet in diameter and 150 feet tall.
The reason it can grow this big even through fires is on account of the heavy bark. And they get to be 300 years old. There's been many fires in 300 years. The first 3 16-footers, is the way I put it, were straight lumber in it so that they didn't curl much, and they free knots. And that was really good for building homes. The white pine is a much bigger tree than the red pine is.
We're at the site of the Yellow Banks camp where the Fleming Railroad unloaded their logs on their way to the St. Croix River. Later, this became a site for the CC camp during the Great Depression. Long ago, the name Yellow Banks was given to describe the light-colored sandy soil found here.
When the railroad came through, here and there they would have spurs designated to bring logs to a place such as this. We can see how the tributaries were being used. They were producing communities, villages, towns. It's important to note that this was not just happening in Minnesota. Many think that Wisconsin sent the majority of the logs down the St. Croix. The tributaries were using their own tributaries. The Snake River was using the Ground House. The Kettle River would be using the Grindstone, where Hinckley was built. The Namakagon River was using the Totogatek River. The lower St. Croix was also being used, rivers like the Willow and the Apple. The majority of these logs were being caught by the Stillwater boom. In its peak years, it could back up 9 miles, employ 400 men on one shift, have 20 buildings for transactions, deal with as many as 2,000 different companies having their marks on logs. The new boom provided for river traffic. It had channels built where steamboats, but these at times would clog up too. One time for 57 days these were clogged up, and this boom company had to pay over $146,000.
For a long, long time, probably 75, 80 years, there was a movement by many people in the St. Croix Valley to turn the St. Croix River into a canal between the Great Lakes, Duluth, and the Mississippi River, and this would have been an enormous transportation accomplishment because you could bring goods all the way from the East Coast through the Great Lakes, down the St. Croix River Canal, into the Mississippi and into the heartland of the country. And after the Civil War, before the railroads came, this movement had a good deal of impetus behind it. But once the railroads came, they kind of supplanted the idea.
I'm Sean Comstock, and I'm from Sunrise, Minnesota. And I'm fishing here on the Sunrise River where it flows into St. Croix, and I'm hoping to catch some walleyes.
Hi, I'm Jerry Torville. I'm standing on the bluffs of my property overlooking the beautiful Clam River, It's one of the major tributaries that flow into the St. Croix.
The Danbury, Wisconsin area is unique because it is located at the confluence of three rivers. The Namakagon and the Yellow Rivers both flow into the St. Croix. The town of Danbury was named after 1911. It was chosen from the middle name of James Daniel Glass. In 1855, a survey was done for a proposed railroad, which would go through present-day Danbury. Promoters and investors started a village, Narusiewicz. Milwaukee speculator W.P. Graves spent $20,000 to build a dam and sawmill on the Yellow River. The county was set off in 1856 and was to have Narusiewicz as its seat. In 1857, a financial panic ended the whole deal and it quickly disappeared. Grantsburg was chosen when it was started in 1865. By 1870, there were 3 communities in Burnett County: Grantsburg, Wood River, and Trade Lake. The total population in Burnett was 706 people, not including the indigenous population. At this time, the largest community in the Burnett County was Trade Lake, with almost half the registered population. Grantsburg was pretty much an empty town site in 1865, with 1 log building and a sawmill. Canute Anderson named Grantsburg in honor of General Grant's victory of Vicksburg and its surrender July 4th, 1863. The main crops in these communities in the late 1800s were cranberries, blueberries, and potatoes.
Beside me here is the old blacksmith shop of Trade Lake, Wisconsin. Behind me is what's left of the old creamery. This mill was big. You can see on both sides, my right and to my left, that the walls are still left, and it's really a big old mill. This here is the cemetery of Trade Lake, which is right next to the Swedish Mission Church, and next to me is one of the graves of my great-grandparents and many grave sites of many old pioneers that were buried here.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Schaefer. I'm from Grantsburg, Wisconsin, home of Croix Meadows. Croix Meadows is a 30,000-acre state wildlife management area. Since 1946, over 22 miles of dikes have been constructed to create 29 flowages which flood 7,000 acres. Croix Meadows is related to the St. Croix River watershed through waterways such as the Wood River.
Two bridges cross the upper St. Croix between the states. One between Danbury, Wisconsin and Hinckley, Minnesota. 77 on the Wisconsin side, 48 on the Minnesota. The other is Interstate 70 that goes through Grantsburg, Wisconsin.
The Pine Barrens are an area that roughly stretches from near Wolf Creek, Wisconsin, off to the northeast for many miles, hundreds of thousands of acres, up past Grantsburg, Wisconsin, into Douglas County, almost as far as Lake Superior. This is an area that was left behind after the last ice age.
It's called the Barrens because of the lack of trees, but the lack of trees does not mean lack of diversity or lack of habitats. Indeed, the low topography allowed the many types of habitats to form, including lots of water. Croix Meadows is an excellent example of that, and that is one of the best birding areas in the entire state of Wisconsin.
Attempts at converting this to farmland have failed in the past.
Because of the poor agriculture, the population has never been very heavy in the Barrens area, and a lot of the land became public land like the Governor Knoll State Forest, which runs along the St. Croix River and is at the south and west edge of the Barrens.
You can clearly see the sand in this area, and this is what really the soil type is that we have in the Pine Barrens, the sand barrens of northwest Wisconsin.
By the time you get down to St. Croix Falls, you're no longer in the Barrens area. Here the water drained much more quickly, carrying away those sediments, and you don't have the sorting of the sediments, so you don't have the sand piling up into dunes as you do in the Barrens area. In that stretch from St. Croix Falls to Prescott, Wisconsin, the soils were much more developed from the glacial till, which is a mixture of many types of sediment sizes and much better for agriculture.
The old cast iron New England plows would stick with the rich soils of the Midwest, making plowing almost impossible. John Deere, an accomplished blacksmith from Vermont, moved to Illinois in 1836 and observed this problem, and he invented a prairie plow made of a steel saw blade. This invention solved a great problem, and it opened up even more settlement to this rich, fertile Midwestern land that spurned on the lumber industry.
In 1840, St. Croix County of the Wisconsin Territory was established, and the county seat was placed at Joseph Brown's trading post site at Dakota. A little later on, Dakota became a part of Stillwater, and Stillwater became the county seat of St. Croix County, Wisconsin Territory in 1846. St. Croix County of the Wisconsin Territory went all the way to the Mississippi River, then all the way up to the Canadian border. After Wisconsin became a state, there were delegates in this unorganized territory that came to Stillwater on August 26, 1848, to hold a convention. And this convention was to form a new territory. And during that convention, a resolution was made that the U.S. Congress form a new territory, and this territory be named Minnesota. It was Henry Sibley who was elected to bring this resolution to the U.S. Congress, and because of the convention in Stillwater, the U.S. Congress formed the territory of Minnesota in March of 1849, Stillwater then becoming known as the birthplace of Minnesota. When Minnesota became a territory, Stillwater became the county seat of Washington County of the Minnesota Territory and later the state. And today, the old courthouse sits on the Zion's Hill, constructed back in 1867, and is now the oldest standing courthouse in the state of Minnesota. After Minnesota became a territory, it wasn't until May 11, 1858, that Minnesota became the 32nd state of the United States.
In 1849, when Minnesota became a territory, there were approximately 5,000 settlers. When it became a state in 1858, there were 100,000. Also, in 1850, Stillwater was the second largest city, St. Paul being the first. In the 1840s, John McCusick's sawmill was the only sawmill that was in Stillwater. After 1852, this would change and Stillwater would become the capital of the sawmills along the St. Croix.
In 1854, Stillwater was incorporated as a city in the territory of Minnesota the same day as St. Paul. That same year, John McCusick was elected Stillwater's first mayor.
He also named Stillwater.
Stillwater is actually the first town at the widening of the St. Croix River, which becomes Lake St. Croix. Because of this, Stillwater became an ideal location for the lumber industry of the 1800s.
Alexander Ramsey became the first territorial governor of Minnesota.
In the 1850s, there were 4 mills that serviced the city of Stillwater. They were the Schulenburg-Bochler Mill, the Sawyer-Heaton Mill, the John McCusick Mill, and the Hersey-Staples Mill at the south end of town.
Schulenburg and Bochler were from St. Louis, and everything they cut went to St. Louis. During the lumbering era, they were the largest concern and put out the most amount of board feet. Isaac Staples ran a close second. He eventually bought Hersey out, and he would become the most prominent businessman along the St. Croix River Valley.
4 of his brothers, as well as 1 sister, followed his lead and came to the area. Samuel came to Stillwater. Silas came to Willow River, where he sold land to Joseph Burkhart for the mill. Winslow came to Lakeland, and George to Kennebec County.
He built a mansion overlooking the St. Croix in what is today known as Pioneer Park for his wife and 7 children. Staples also owned 7 large farms, was asked to run for governor 4 times, in which he declined, became the mayor of Stillwater, was involved with its civic life, became president of Minnesota's Historical Society.
In my opinion, Isaac Staples and his wife Olivia were 2 of the most important people in the history of Stillwater, the St. Croix Valley, and the state of Minnesota.
After being in the area for only 7 years, Isaac Staples owned over 200,000 acres of land, and his wife helped start the first library and hospital in Stillwater. On May 14, 1852, Stillwater had a landslide due to spring rains. This added approximately 8 acres Coupled with the new boom site built in 1856, this made Stillwater a powerhouse. Stillwater would also have a dozen bars. All through the St. Croix Valley, lumberjacks would come out of the woods and they would seek hotels, bars, and brothels.
Hi, I'm Jill Greenhall, and today we are at Arcola, Minnesota, along the St. Croix River, just 6 miles north of Stillwater, Minnesota, site of one of the oldest homes in the state of Minnesota, home of pioneer lumbermen Martin and John Moore, built in 1847. This river, the St. Croix, brought pioneer lumbermen John and Martin Moore here. They founded what then became the Arcola Village, where once upon a time in the 1840s, there were over 40 people living here. There were 2 sawmills, there was a boat building operation, a carpentry shop, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and the homes of half a dozen of the mill workers. This site is the site of the original Arcola sawmill, built in 1847 and switched to steam power in 1854. You'll notice the tall chimney, the remains of the sawmill today. At this site, the water that runs so fresh in all these springs and into the St. Croix powered the 2 Arcola sawmills. This site was once the site of a steamboat building operation back in the 1860s.
There's still a number of working farms here in Arcola today, raising corn, raising cattle.
Somerset, Wisconsin is located on the Apple River, which flows into the St. Croix River. Somerset, Wisconsin was founded during the logging era, and the Apple River was used to float logs down to the St. Croix River. Somerset, Wisconsin was established in 1856 and had an area post office. Pioneers had to push back the forest for farming, and they erected a sawmill and a grist mill on the Apple River. This log cabin behind me is the oldest established home in Somerset, and it's located on the Apple River and the St. Croix River. The Somerset community is still widely used for farming. The Apple River in the Somerset area today is used for recreation.
By the 1860s, some 120 steamboats made it up to the falls of the St. Croix during the season, and the season usually ran from mid-April to November, depending on freeze-up time. As commerce and settlement developed along the St. Croix, steamboats began to be made along the St. Croix River. The first steamboats were very crude craft, but over the years they were adapted for specific needs: towboats and barges, passenger boats. Eventually the boats became very elegant for excursionists from the east.
A dry dock for steamboats was built here in 1856. For over 50 years, ferry boats, raft boats, packet boats, boom boats, and snag boats were built on the Prescott levee. Prescott men also built and repaired keel boats, barges, motor launches, skiffs, clam boats, sailboats, and rowboats. 2 steamboats were used to move large log rafts downriver. The rafts floated with the current moving about 4 miles an hour. Logs coming from upriver sometimes came in small rafts, and sometimes free-floating. Then were assembled at Prescott in larger rafts to go down the Mississippi. Hello, I'm Chuck. We're in Prescott, Wisconsin, Pierce County, and we're about 3 blocks from where the St. Croix River flows into the Mississippi. Philander Prescott applied for a license to run a ferry in the early days of the town, and he is the first recorded owner of this means of transportation.
I'm Bob Muller. I live at Deer Lake in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin. I've been a riverboat pilot for 70 years.
We were married March 9th, 1940.
My grandfather and his brother started the boat works in 1873 in a building 20 by 40. My grandfather built over 100 boats, including stern wheels during the logging era. 7 generations of the Mullers have been involved on the St. Croix River. My father started the boat business back in 1906 with an 8-passenger boat.
Dells is an old French word
and roughly translated means water running through a deep and rocky gorge. The Princess travels through two dells areas on the St. Croix River, the one right here in Taylor's Falls, where we're located now, and the other one's about 3 miles south of us in the area of Franconia.
This is the site of the early steamboat landing for the port of Taylor's Falls, and the spot that many immigrants came.
If you go to the Taylor Falls area, you can see many of the old rings that the steamboats would hook up to back in the pioneer days. Taylor's Falls became a state park in 1895, the second state park in the state of Minnesota, Itasca being the first. The Wisconsin side became a state park in 1900, the first in the state of Wisconsin. These two soon linked up and became the first interstate park system in our country.
Mount Hope was founded in 1863, right in the middle of the American Civil War, and we're standing at the monument of Captain Oscar Knapp and his family. Captain Knapp was one of the most famous riverboat captains on the St. Croix. Captain Kent, who's buried here, was on the St. Croix River for 15 years.
He helped found the city of Osceola, and he also built steamboats. He helped start the first lumber mill and the first grist mill. Osceola also was given credit for building 10 steamboats.
The first bridge was built here in 1896, just a little bit north of this present bridge. Before that, they had a ferry.
Hello, my name is Dorothy Wilson. We're seated here at the Octagon House in Hudson, Wisconsin. This is the home of the St. Croix County Historical Society. The Octagon House was constructed in 1855 for a man named John Shaw Moffett. 4 generations of the Moffett Hughes family lived in the house. In 1964, the house was acquired by the St. Croix County Historical Society and turned into a Victorian museum.
I'm Willis Miller of Hudson, Wisconsin. I have been associated with the Hudson Star Observer for 65 years. This paper in Hudson is the only paper, and it was established here in 1854. This is the Hudson Area Biographical Index, which I have compiled over the past 60 years. There are 200,000 entries in this. Hudson has had 3 names since its founding in 1840. First it was Willow River, then Buena Vista in 1847, and finally Hudson in 1852. The name of Hudson was chosen because of the high palisades on the St. Croix River reminded the pioneers of their native Hudson River Valley in New York State. Logging began in Hudson in the early 1840s, and a mill was built on Willow River in 1848. Steamboats also docked in Hudson, and logs were rafted and milled here. The last sawmill closed in 1917. Agriculture had its start in Hudson and St. Croix County in the early 1850s and still flourishes.
My name is Maggie Hall, and we're standing here today in our family schoolhouse museum. It's located on our family farm 5 miles east of Hudson, Wisconsin.
The house behind me is on the farm that my great-grandfather bought in 1877.
We do have 7 generations of Kinneys in the St. Croix Valley area. On our dairy farm, we raised sheep, chickens, and had dairy cows. We also grew corn and oats. As the logging in the big woods moved north, the agriculture followed right behind. Large wheat fields were in the area, and dairy farming was not far behind.
My husband, Bernard Kinney, and I raised our 11 children on this farm, and now my son and his children are growing up here.
The ancient Chippewa Indian mounds offers a magnificent view of the St. Croix. When I was a boy, these mounds were about a foot high, but have since been reshaped by the Park Service. These mounds were here before the coming of the white man. At the making of this film, we're looking at the 3rd bridge. The Hudson Interstate Bridge connects major cities such as Chicago, Milwaukee, and Madison with the Twin Cities. This makes the bridge a main artery.
Well, bridges are always about commerce, and so I think it's significant that the first road on the Wisconsin side across from Stillwater ran from the mill at Burkhart to the crossing over to Stillwater, which in the earliest days was a ferry. So 1876 displaced the ferry. The ferryman was very unhappy. He actually sued the city for the loss of his livelihood, but he didn't get very far. That bridge lasted more or less through a couple of fires, a couple of catastrophes until 1931 when the present lift bridge was built.
Sauger. Another beautiful. Let's try that again. Yeah. Take two.
One of the unique things about the St. Croix and its Namakagon tributary is the fact that these rivers are not stocked. The fishing population is healthy through natural reproduction. All of the fishes found in the upper Mississippi drainage are found in both of these rivers.
As logging took over the river, jams frequently blocked passage on the river. The boats would stop at one side of a log jam. The passengers would have to walk around the jam and then board a boat on the other side of it to continue their trip.
The old paddle wheelers 150 years ago, they were a little more difficult, a little more uncomfortable to ride on, with the smoke belching out of the smokestacks and the hiss of the steam from the steam drives. Also, the passengers brought everything they owned, including chickens and hogs and pigs and so forth.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to Gammelgården. Gammelgården means old small farm in Swedish, and that's what this is. It is a farm from the 1850s when the first Swedish settlers came to Scandia.
In the 1850s, more than 12,000 Swedish immigrants came to the St. Croix Valley and called this place their home. And after that, even more arrived.
At one time, Minnesota's population had more Swedes than any other place in the United States.
This is New Scandia Township. We're standing in front of the old Hay Lake School, which was a rural school in Washington County. School District Number 2 was organized in 1855. This log house was constructed by Johannes Eriksson and his family back in 1868. This type of structure was commonly built in Sweden during that time.
When the immigrants came, they came to opportunity and not much else. There were no buildings, no roads, no institutions. Their first trick was to survive the winter. If you've read the Moberg books, you remember they left Sweden in March, they got to New York in June, came across country to St. Louis by train, then up the Mississippi on a riverboat, and they got to this area in August. So their first task was to find shelter, food, and a heat source to survive the winter. Next year, they'll start building their farm.
In my grandmother's case, for example, she was one of 12 children. And the oldest came here first and then earned enough money to send it back to bring the next one. Then those two worked to send the next one back, and that's how they got here. She was the 11th child who came here, and they left the youngest at home to be with the parents.
Lindstrom, which is about 12 miles north of Scandia, became the large commercial center for this whole Swedish Moberg Trail area. The reasons the immigrants left Sweden, frankly, was they were unhappy with the state church and they were unable to purchase land for themselves or have enough inherited land to survive as a dairying family. Many of them came from Småland and Skåne and were agriculturally oriented. Because they had learned to be good farmers with such poor resources in Sweden, when they came to Minnesota, not only did it look like home, it had rich soil, and their practices of centuries of good farming flourished. And they wrote letters home saying that they were getting 10 and 20 bushels of grain to the acre. They had 5 dairy cows. The people on the other end read these letters and were on the next boat to come. The government hated the letters because they carried immigration fever. Without the St. Croix River, this area could not have been as easily populated by the Swedish immigrants. The river was the gateway to the land of their dreams, where they formed such wonderful communities and lasting communities.
The building behind me is the Gammelkirche. This is the original building for Elam Lutheran Church, and it was built in 1856.
The Elam Cemetery dates back to the 1860s. The second church was built on that property, and the cemetery evolved around church number 2. To think that immigrants would build such a beautiful cemetery is quite a testament to their dreams.
The St. Croix Valley has a lot of mom and pop operations that has a down-to-earth, great home atmosphere that people come to the valley and really enjoy.
The first farming in Minnesota, in fact, the first farming north of Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, took place in Afton, Minnesota. In 1839, Massachusetts-born Joseph Haskell and his companion, James S. Morris, filed a claim in Section 25 in Afton. Afton had the first private grist mill in Minnesota in 1843, built by Emanuel Bowles.
Over a century ago, there was a tradition in the St. Croix Valley of many people growing raspberries. They were marketed commercially, sent by the river, St. Croix River, to markets in St. Paul, St. Anthony, and our farm carries on that tradition today.
The first apples and orchard products came to complete the diet of the farmers. Everybody had a small orchard or whatever. But we got commercial years later when they discovered that the tempering effect of the river gave us a longer ripening season.
Mrs. C.S. Getchell has the honor of naming this beautiful village Afton. The name was taken from Burns' poem, Afton Water. This is a great example of local quilting contributed to by a lot of efficient seamstresses in this area.
Last year, the women made 60 quilts and they were donated to the needy.
Hello. We've done these beautiful rugs to continue the tradition that our forebears started.
My name is Joanna James. I'm from Afton, Minnesota, and I'm a singer-songwriter. So I live right on the St. Croix River, and Afton has this great state park that I go to just about every other day.
Miss you before you've been gone. You're like the seventh chord that leaves me wanting more than makes me ache for home.
Hello, my name's Courtney, and we're at Afton Art Gallery in Afton, Minnesota, along the St. Croix River. The St. Croix Valley is really a unique experience because we're really a patron of the arts. No matter where you go, you're going to see artists and their work featured.
I'm Patricia Johnston. I'm the publisher here at the Afton Historical Society Press. We publish important and beautiful books on Minnesota subjects. John Runk was a Stillwater photographer. In addition to his own photographs, which covered 60 years of Stillwater history, he also collected earlier photographs. If someone in town would bring him an earlier photograph, he would make a copy for them if he could also keep a copy for his collection.
Patricia used John Runk's photographs on her book on Stillwater.
Lake St. Croix stretches from Stillwater, Minnesota to Prescott, Wisconsin. In this 25-mile stretch of river, there's a maximum depth of 78 feet and it totals about 8,200 acres.
Connecticut-born Joel Powell came to the St. Croix Valley in 1848 in the River Falls area along the Kinnickinnick. He's given credit for being the founder. In 1854, he built a lumbering mill. This would build the city of River Falls. In 1854, also a store was started by Nathaniel and Oliver Powell. The post office came in 1856, the first school in 1874, and this school would develop into the University of Wisconsin River Falls.
Before Minnesota became a state, the military road was proposed for safe travel and protection. In 1850, Henry Sibley, Minnesota's first delegate to the Congress of the United States, requested funds for road construction. $40,000 was appropriated for the project. 5 roads were proposed. The road we are discussing was deemed the St. Louis River Road. Starting at Point Douglas in Denmark Township, Washington County, at the mouth of the St. Croix River, the military road begins.
We're off the main road here. The military road came right through here at one time, right here by the cemetery.
Point Douglas, Minnesota, in Denmark Township, at one time was a thriving community. It had a sawmill, 2 stores, one of the first post offices, a school. It was also on the Mississippi River. It had a steamboat landing. In the mid-1850s, it began to fade. Prescott built up its levee. It became an excellent steamboat landing. Hastings began to rise, which was across from Point Douglas on the Mississippi River. Today, we still have the old school that was in Point Douglas, but many people do not realize at one time this was a thriving town.
From Afton, the road followed the west bank of the river north to Valley Creek, known today as Stagecoach Trail. From Stillwater, the road went northwest across the Browns Creek Ravine via the Stone Bridge.
The old stone bridge that the military road ran over is on the National Register of Historic Places. In the abstract for the property, where the old stone bridge sits, the property was originally deeded by the United States to John McCusick in the year 1848. That's before Minnesota was even a territory. Later on, in 1881, Isaac Staples purchased the property.
Today, Stonebridge Trail intersects again with Highway 95 and northerly through Marine and to Taylor Falls. From Taylor Falls to the town of Sunrise on the Sunrise River, the contracts ran out due to lack of funds.
The military road was not just for the military, it was for everyone. The War Department put out the funds.
In a land advertising pamphlet of 1859, Oliver Gibbs at Prescott stated that the greatest need along the St. Croix continued to be for, quote, farmers who can develop the resources of the country.
To encourage farming and settlement, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homesteading Act in 1862. This act would have profound effects, but not until after the Civil War.
Here we are in Star Prairie, Wisconsin, standing on the banks of the Apple River. We are on the site of the original grist mill and sawmill that serviced this area. The grist mill, which was the place where farmers would bring their corn and grains to be ground, was still operating in the 1950s when I was a boy.
Right now, we are standing on the dividing line between Polk County, Wisconsin, where our farm is located, and St. Croix County, Wisconsin.
We are presently standing in Section 33, Range 18 West, within the town of Alden. We're midway between Osceola, Wisconsin, and New Richmond, Wisconsin.
The Johnson family came from Norway in 1868 and settled on this land right here.
At the time of settlement, people largely settled in areas where similar ethnic groups existed. Off to the east, it was largely Norwegians. To the west of us, it was largely Germans.
In New Richmond, Wisconsin, a lot of Irish people settled.
The back of me, we have the German settlements of the 1860s and 1870s. Here we have the abstracts and plat books of the 1860s, 1870s, the settlers, and a lot of these names are still here and still live in this area. In the back of me is our herd of dairy cattle that's been in the family for 4 generations.
Who says Norwegians and Germans can't get along?
Right here we have Lincoln's legacy, all original 160-acre farms.
Wisconsin originally was famous for raising wheat. The wheat depleted the soil, the prices became very bad. The state of Wisconsin then took the initiative to encourage farmers to raise dairy cattle.
Gradually, with the dairy developing, the cows needed the corn, and then the crops developed and changed into soybeans, hay ground. All of this came about Today we are growing soybeans and hay and oats and corn, and those are the main crops in this area.
Due to the fact they had no refrigeration, the logical choice was to turn their milk into cheese.
To this day, the state of Wisconsin is known for its excellent cheese, and that includes the St. Croix Valley. In 1859, the new state of Minnesota actually made a profit on its agricultural exports.
Here we are at the West Emmanuel Church, a few miles from Osceola, very close to Horse Creek, Wisconsin. This was the first church built by the Scandinavian immigrants to this part of the country. The word kirk on the front of the church means church in Norwegian. My great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather are both buried here in the cemetery.
There are great farms in Cottage Grove down by Denmark Township, on the other side of Prescott in the Wisconsin area. But we can see here that farming was happening along with logging. Many of the farmers worked in the logging industry to support their farms. The St. Croix River did not just have logs floating down it. Wheat, corn, grain, and produce were being shipped on the river. A great time to visit the St. Croix Valley is in the fall when the harvest comes in. The St. Croix still is wonderful, rich farmland that grows many kinds of products, from pumpkins to fine wines.
I am so blessed to be at the river where I am so moved by the stories in the rocks, the placidity and peacefulness of the current, and the color and the charm and the colors and the light. It's too much. It's more than I can bear sometimes.
When Minnesota became a territory in 1849, Stillwater was hoping to be its capital. That was given to St. Paul. But what Stillwater did get was the territorial prison.
The territorial legislature found a spot in Stillwater for the prison. On the north end of town, it was a ravine, kind of enclosed on 3 different sides, and it had a nickname. It was called Battle Hollow. It got that bloody nickname because of a Native American battle that took place there about 12 years earlier in 1839. The prison started construction in 1851, and it was completed in 1853, and the first warden to take control of the prison was Francis Delano. By the turn of the 20th century, the old Stillwater prison on the north end of town was not functional very much for a prison. So a new prison was started construction in a community just south of Stillwater with the name of South Stillwater. So by 1914, the last convicts at the old Minnesota prison here in Stillwater were marched down Main Street down to the new prison in South Stillwater. That town now is known as Bayport. Some of the most infamous prisoners that stayed behind the walls of the Stillwater prison were actually 3 brothers. They were Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, and they rode with another set of brothers that were probably more famous than them. That was Frank and Jesse James.
My name is Orrin DeLong, and we're at the Northfield Bank, where the James Younger gang had an attempted robbery on September 7th, 1876. I play the part of Adelbert Ames. My name is Adelbert Ames. I was a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. I was appointed governor of Mississippi by President Grant. While governor, I was impeached for stealing $75,000. I was exonerated by Congress. I moved to Northfield, Minnesota, and I was a major stockholder in the Northfield Bank. I married Blanche Butler, whose father was a general in the Union Army and was the military governor of New Orleans and was called the Beast of New Orleans. The James Younger gang knew about the Ames-Butler connection. At this time in the gang, Cole Younger and Frank James were the leaders. The gang had 8 members: the 2 James brothers, the 3 Younger brothers, and Pitts, Miller, and Stiles. Stiles was from this area, and he was to be their guide both before and after the raid. On Thursday afternoon, September 7th, Adelbert Ames and his father and his brother were coming back from the bank. They met 3 riders. One of the riders said, "There's the governor." While they were in jail in Faribault, Ames went to visit Cole Younger. Ames said in his diary that Younger thought that a large amount of money from Ames was in the Northfield Bank. The three men in the bank were Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts. In the doorway was Clell Miller. Bob Younger jumped up on the counter, threatening the teller Wilcox with 2 guns. The other 2 men went around to the gate and came in back of the 2 tellers. J.S. Allen went back to the bank, met Clell Miller in the doorway here, and could see something was going on, and ran down the street yelling, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank." Haywood was at this desk. He was told to open the safe. At the same time, Cole Younger rode up to the doorway of the bank, yelling to the men inside, "Get out of there, they're killing us out here." And as Frank was sitting on the counter, he saw Haywood opening a secret drawer. He turned around and shot Haywood. Haywood was shot in the head and died instantly. They never did get any money, though there was money in the safe. The other man who was killed from Northfield was a Swedish immigrant, Nicholas Gustafson. Wheeler, who is on the second floor of the Dampier building, shoots and kills Miller with his carbine. Stiles was killed by Ansel Manning with a rifle. The other outlaw that was killed was Charlie Pitts. He was killed near Madelia, Minnesota in the Hanska Slough. By this time, Frank and Jesse had already split with the Youngers and headed towards South Dakota. There were over 150 people in the posse that cornered the 3 Younger brothers in Pitts near the Hanska Slough. This is the picture of the 7 men who killed Pitts and captured the other 3 Younger brothers. The 3 Younger brothers were all wounded, some of them very badly, when they were captured. The Younger brothers, after they were captured, were tried in Faribault for first-degree murder. They pled guilty and were sentenced to life in prison in Stillwater, Minnesota on the St. Croix River.
When the Youngers entered the Stillwater prison, they became model prisoners. And throughout the years of their confinement, they were highly respected not only by other inmates, but by the guards and the wardens themselves. The Prison Mirror is a convict-started newspaper, and it was started with $200 of inmate funds. Now the Younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, donated $50 of that $200 to start the Prison Mirror. Today, the Prison Mirror is still published. It is the nation's oldest continuously published prison newspaper. It was started back in 1887. Unfortunately, in 1889, Bob Younger, the youngest of the Younger brothers, completed his life sentence when he died in the prison of tuberculosis. A few years later, there were many petitions coming to the state legislature to free, to pardon, to get the Younger brothers out of prison. And so in 1901, Cole and Jim Younger became 2 of the first life prisoners in Minnesota to be paroled.
Cole Younger died on March 21st, 1916, of heart disease at the age of 72. It was discovered upon his death that he still had 14 bullets embedded in his body.
He was wanted, dead or alive.
In 1861, the railroad came to Minnesota. The St. Paul and Pacific, built by the Northern Pacific Railroad, went between Duluth and St. Paul. In 1870, this line built branches that came into the St. Croix Valley. One through North Branch into Taylor's Falls, the other through White Bear Lake, and then along Browns Creek into Stillwater.
The Omaha branch was next. It came to the valley in 1872. This line ran east and west from St. Paul to Chicago. It switched tracks at Stillwater Junction, 2 miles south of Stillwater, and this line hauled passengers, carried freight, and served the Anderson Corporation and the prison at Bayport. It also extended south out of Hudson, Wisconsin, and ran through River Falls to Ellsworth. The Milwaukee came to the valley in 1882. It was nicknamed the Peanut. Its lifeblood was hauling freight. This branch line ran from Hastings to Stillwater.
We're in Point Douglas, Minnesota, at the mouth of the St. Croix River. Behind me is the footings of the old rail line that ran from Hastings, Minnesota to Stillwater, Minnesota.
Late in the 1880s, the Sioux Line came through the valley. This line hauled an assortment of freight, including lumber, produce, and general merchandise, and passengers. The main line ran from St. Paul to Superior, Wisconsin, with a branch running from Osceola through Dresser and St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin.
The tracks that we operate were the original line of the Sioux Line that was built by the Kellogg's, the Washburns, and the Pillsburys to get their grain to the Great Lakes to bypass the tariffs out of Chicago.
The Sioux Line Railroad is the line that built the historic High Bridge over the St. Croix River a few miles north of Stillwater. Prescott, Wisconsin, also being on the Mississippi, was serviced by the Burlington Railroad. This line handled freight and passengers. This was a main line running from the Twin Cities to Chicago, and Prescott being one of its stops. Depots were the hub of the rail system. Here one could ship or receive, purchase passenger tickets, transfer to another line, meet or pick up friends or relatives. All places the railroad stopped had a depot. The larger the town, the more elegant the depot.
Hudson, Wisconsin also was a major manufacturer of railroad cars, and it was the main city on the St. Croix River for the railroad. Two thriving towns along the St. Croix River on the Minnesota side were Sunrise and Franconia. When the railroad didn't go through these two towns, it had devastating consequences.
The house behind me, it used to be the old Franconia Hotel. Franconia was a river town that died right after the railroad came in. It at one time had about 500 residents. Many of the houses were dismantled. This is one of them. It was the hotel, as I had said, and was rebuilt up here, up out of the ravines.
There's an old saying that goes, it's not the town that makes the railroad, it's the railroad that makes the town.
The train cars that are operated by the Osceola and St. Croix Valley Railway are part of the Great Northern Rail Cars system. They were actually owned by James J. Hill family in the heyday of passenger railroading. Behind me is a picture of James J. Hill, the founder of the Great Northern Railway. We're actually standing in the car that belonged to Louis Hill, his son. We are creating a trip back in time, back in the 1800s, early 1900s, in vintage cars along the scenic St. Croix River.
The railroads could work in the wintertime, unlike the river that would freeze. The railroads would help bring in the decline of the steamboats along the St. Croix River. Their heyday was in the 1860s through 90s.
The Hinckley Fire took place on September 1st, 1894. The Hinckley Fire lasted 4 hours. It rose to a height of 5 miles into the atmosphere so that people in Mason City, Iowa could actually see the fire from that distance. The Hinckley Fire made national news and international news. The Hinckley Fire was on the front page of the London Times for 5 days, on the front page of the New York papers for 7 days.
Much of the logging was done on government land, and there wasn't really a lot of care for the land. When the loggers would cut the pines, they would leave the tops and the branches on the forest floor. This slash would dry out, and because they weren't replanting, there wasn't a lot of green on the forest floor, and the right conditions could easily produce a major fire. The Hinckley Fire would actually burn an area of 400 square miles. It would actually jump the St. Croix River and go into Wisconsin. C.C. Andrews had written a scholarly paper on conservation and reforestation. He gave a speech on this paper in New York 7 days before the Hinckley Fire and said that the entire state of Minnesota would burn if we didn't start changing some things.
The Department of Minnesota Forestry was formed. C.C. Andrews was the first chief fire warden. The DNR today traces their very existence back to this fire and the results of it.
Over 400 people died as a result of the Hinckley Fire. After the Hinckley Fire, laws changed. Tree farms arose. Companies had to replant, reforest. Fire wardens, fire towers. Many things happened as a result of the Hinckley Fire.
We're standing in front of the General C.C. Andrews State Forest. This is really a tribute to the man who was later called the father of Minnesota forestry.
On June 12, 1914, the last great drive of logs entered the Stillwater boom. The great white pine forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota are all but gone. Over 11,250,000,000 board feet of lumber had been cut in about 60 years. In 1890 alone, over 450 million board feet was cut. The logging industry had employed thousands of men along the St. Croix River, had brought great wealth to the states of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and helped build the Midwest, was sadly over.
Stillwater's prominence, of course, came because of the lumbering industry, but when that faded, the town faded, and there was a lot of poverty in Stillwater, and a lot of the buildings, nothing happened to them, which is sort of a static period. But the end result is a lot of the beautiful buildings, the lumber baron estates and the smaller neighborhoods were preserved because nothing really happened.
The house was built in 1857 by a man named Albert Harris, and he was from Kentucky. He didn't stay here long because when the Civil War broke out, you know, his heart was in the South and he returned. And then the Jeffersons bought the home. Amos Jefferson was a prominent banker in Hudson, and his wife Jenny actually started the first ladies' auxiliary. And oftentimes you would walk past the house and see the women gathered in the parlor in black going over the casualties of the Civil War. And what stemmed from that group of women actually was the first public library of Hudson. The Jeffersons also had a famous grandson by the name of Wilder Penfield, and he is, or was, a world-renowned brain surgeon in Canada. He spent much of his youth here in the house. In 1919, Cecil and Genevieve Day purchased the home. Genevieve Day became a prominent historian and later wrote Hudson in the early days. It was published in 1932. Genevieve also helped start the Historical Society at the Octagon House.
Happy Thanksgiving. Happy holidays.
In 1863, when President Lincoln declared it a national holiday, the Jeffersons would have been spending their first Thanksgiving here in this very room.
The St. Croix is a historical river, and when you come into these bed and breakfasts, when you go into the shops, you're really taking a walk back into time.
Next year, this building will be 100 years old. In the St. Croix Valley, there are a lot of buildings like this where you can just walk through the door and walk back in time.
For this old store, it's so much fun.
Hello, my name is Robin Foster. I'm an artist. I live in Osceola, Wisconsin, on the St. Croix River Valley. I do many forms of art, jewelry in silver and gold. I design artifacts in leather, beadwork, porcupine quill work, sweetgrass basketry, bitten birch bark, rawhide, and I also tan deer hides the old way. The majority of what I do is inspired by my love of Native American art, history, and spirituality.
After the hunting season, instead of feeding it on the fist like I am now, I will toss food into the chambers, breaking that bond between me and her. And then I usually let them go in the same area that I trapped them. This bird was wild a week ago. Here we're at the Allen King plant, and at the 400-foot level, halfway up, is a nest box that we put up in 1988 with NSP and Bob Anderson with the Raptor Resource Project. And this is where breeding on smokestacks, placing nest boxes started. It's now being done worldwide. We banned DDT, we stopped using it, and the peregrine falcon is coming back. So for the younger generation, I like to leave a positive note that it can be corrected.
William O'Brien State Park is located just off Highway 95, halfway between Stillwater and Taylor's Falls. From the original donation from Alice O'Brien, the park has grown to 1,650 acres and still growing today. In William O'Brien State Park, this is one of the areas that we're managing as a wetland. Right next to me is one of the plant species that we've re-established in the park. It's the wild rose. Another plant that we're trying to reestablish is hoary puccoon. Another favorite that's been reestablished in the park is the wild turkey. We're now in the area of the park that's part of the Big Woods ecosystem, which we are trying to manage and preserve for. The state parks of Minnesota have a mission statement. We will work with the people of Minnesota to provide a state park system which preserves and manages Minnesota's natural, scenic, and cultural resources for present and future generations, while providing appropriate recreation and educational opportunities.
The beauty of the St. Croix River has really brought the calling out for me to be a photographer. I loved growing up here. I loved everything about it, the quiet, the tranquility. It just brought my calling out to be a photographer.
Carpenter Nature Center is a privately funded nonprofit facility with 425 acres in Minnesota and 295 acres in Wisconsin. And we've found now that we have badgers, coyotes, ground squirrels, and many species of birds that didn't used to nest here 20 years ago that are back now. We've counted 154 species of birds here over the last 20 years.
Outside of the state parks, there are many local city and county parks for people to visit.
Hello, my name is Mark Baer. I'm the Managing Director of St. Croix Festival Theater, a professional nonprofit theater located in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin. Our resident company consists of a handful of actors, directors, and designers who have made St. Croix Falls and the St. Croix Valley their home.
You were a kid once, yeah, and it took me years to get over.
Up and down the St. Croix Valley, you will find the arts.
Her front is day, her back is night. She recollects the dawn of life. Tidal waves run up her spine and lightning tingles when it strikes. She can feel the fishes roam in her fingers and her toes. In her chest, the Gulf Stream.
Many people fought in the Civil War along the St. Croix River and other wars. In 2004, there was a memorial put up across from the old courthouse in Stillwater.
Oh, This I'll tell you from my soul. I'll wait for you. I'll wait for you.
Stillwater right now has about 500,000 books within a 6-block area of the downtown. This book was published in 1857, which was a year before Minnesota became a state. Here's a copy of the Minnesota and Its Resources by J.W. Bond, which was first published in 1853. Andreas Atlas, as it's called, would sell for from anywhere from $1,700 to $2,000.
The shelves you have just looked at are regional authors. Many of these authors come in and shop at the bookstore and are interviewed and do author signings at the bookstore.
I work with local stones that are found here in the St. Croix Valley. Here's an example of some earrings made from local agates. This building was originally a one-room schoolhouse built in 1874. Here are examples of work in marble, serpentine, jade, and amethyst. Besides being a gemologist, I've also learned to cut my own stones so that I can design unique and original jewelry.
We're fortunate to have these buildings because the St. Croix River was not developed after the logging era. One corporation that has been a part of the history of the St. Croix, though, is Anderson Window.
Anderson started in Hudson, Wisconsin in 1903. We had 12 employees. The company moved in 1913 to South Stillwater, Minnesota, which is now Bayport, and we now have 8,500 employees across the United States. Anderson's Bayport facility is the largest manufacturing facility in the Midwest. It's 65 acres under one roof.
The St. Croix Valley has many faces. You can be at a canoe and camping trip or an antique store or golf course. It has many fine restaurants and many things to do for people young and old.
Water is the most critical resource issue of our lifetime and our children's lifetime. The health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. Luna Leopold.
We all want a river to be more than beautiful. We want it to be pure and clean, water that we can swim in, fish that we can eat.
We're called to be stewards of the land, not plunderers. And hopefully we can honor future generations and save other places, like the St. Croix River, a river of dreams.
I will meet you by the river at dusk on the hottest day of summer, in the brace of the only cool breeze, to dance with the willow boughs. I will meet you by the river, to stretch with the shadows and assemble the enclave of silence that pauses to ponder the gathering sunset. I will meet you by the river, the brook of the solstice, the tributary that casts shade on your reflection of time. Oh, I will meet you by the river, to wade in the current of faith itself, to cleanse my sins of doubt and laugh at the compromise of dawn. I will meet you by the river, to vanquish our unspoken phantoms and embark on a journey that only the light-hearted may grasp. I will meet you by the river.
Hello, I'm Joe Narusiewicz, the maker of the St. Croix River, River of Dreams. I want to thank everybody from the St. Croix Valley who helped make this film come true. And I want to apologize to everyone I left out and what I left out. But it is impossible to cover everything in a short film like this. People ask me how I did the St. Croix River and why. I was brought up in South St. Paul along the Mississippi, and we had the packing house, the Swifts and Armors, along with a sewage disposal plant. And the Mississippi never had that Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer kind of feeling for me. And when I read about it, it was like, oh, wow, they had it, but I just didn't have it. It was very polluted at that time. But when I was growing up, the St. Croix was always the opposite. It represented beauty, fun, adventure, all those things to me. And it's been in my memory since I've been a boy. So that probably was the subconscious morale motivation to do it. I could have easily paid somebody or had a totally professional announcer come in. But I sort of use a cinema verite concept, you know, the handheld camera, things in motion, people's lives in motion. A lot of these interviews were done just almost on the moment. You know, there wasn't a ton of planning, and let's go to a studio and get a light kit and all this. But I think there's something to say for that. Sometimes the enthusiasm that the people have for their region is more powerful than the polish of bringing somebody in that isn't from the region, but they're good narrators. So I think there might be a bit of a trade-off there, but I go with the nostalgia when it comes to a documentary. And I think it shows through in this film. A lot of the people that were interviewed, you know, they might have been even shy on camera, but their enthusiasm comes through because they love their area. They may not have the King's English the best, but that's sort of a cinema verite concept that I like to put in with it. The other thing I like to do is the main star is the universal, the river, the beauty of the river, the grandeur of the river. It was here before we came. It'll be here when we're gone. And I always like to see that aspect flow through. You know, along with the cognitive, you have the amygdala, the emotional part. So I like the concept of you know, you get a warm puppy in your hands and you can't help but pet it, or a little kitten. There's something about that that's just natural. It's universal, it's human. And it's the same with nature. You know, you put them in a garden with rivers. Well, that is deep embedded in our subconscious. Plus, it breaks things up. It's nice to be able to get a bunch of facts and then have a break from it. So, you know, when you're doing a film, you get a bunch of history, then it's all of a sudden nice to hear some music with the beauty of the river, which is the main subject in this film to begin with. Yeah, so it's sort of like a up the hill, down the hill concept. And I'm saying that for young filmmakers because I hope that a lot of you people with the technology we have today, a lot of you young folks, that you don't just look to Hollywood, look out your back door. The preservation of the St. Croix River is a true accomplishment. I heard that Gaylord Nelson, the senator from Wisconsin, went fishing with the senator from Minnesota, Walter Mondale, and they started to speak on how it would be such a tragedy to see the St. Croix lost to industrialization and urbanization. And they put in motion the salvaging of it, a plan, in order to save something in our modern times, especially in our democracy, a nation of laws. You have to have litigation. And their foresight helped save the St. Croix River, and for them I'm very appreciative. That's one of the reasons why that they're mentioned in my dedication at the very end of the film, along with James Taylor Dunn, who is an author from Marine on St. Croix, and I read most of his book. And I thought It was a very, very excellent book. And all through this film, I met his name. So our concern definitely goes into future generations. We may not get a pat on the back for it, but it does get appreciated somewhere along the line. I would also say to people, visit your historical societies, support them. It's great that we have a national registry. It's great that we're preserving buildings. The same man, the same architect that built the state capitol in St. Paul, built the Stillwater Depot. The Stillwater Depot was intact, a beautiful building. It was torn down, and the building it was torn down for in the 1960s has already been torn down. We can never get that building back. We can't get back this heritage. And sometimes it gets so ridiculous that they'll tear these buildings down, and then 50, 60 years later, they'll reconstruct them from the architectural plans that they find. Why didn't we just preserve it to begin with? But we can't do that if there aren't people and heritage centers and historical societies. So I encourage every Bergen village to have something to do with their history. As far as environmentalism, I want to hear songbirds. How would you like to wake up in the morning and not hear the songbirds? They come right up the Mississippi Valley. This is a major area for their salvation. How would you like to go to a lake and catch a nice walleye, northern, sunfish, crappies? Can't eat them. Polluted, full of mercury, full of lead. Is that being good stewards? I don't think it's that complicated. You know, it's we have to be careful. We have to have some kind of courtesy. Why should we leave a bunch of polluted lakes and rivers for another generation? That's not righteous. It's simple. You know, that's, to me, it's just a simple Judeo-Christian ethic. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. For us to have, take time with law, litigation, and make sure that our rivers and our lakes and streams are passed on to a future generation. That's part of the quality of life. Okay, so you live in a beautiful home. You got a good job. What about the quality of life? You still, you know, we need forests, we need wilderness, we need birds. I may never see a tiger in the wild, but man, I'm glad they're out there. And that's how I feel about nature. Even if I don't have along as far as my own life is concerned, I'm just so glad that it's going to be there for another generation. Now, I feel connected to mankind in a sense of a feeling of a good future when I know that places like the St. Croix River are there. It makes me happy that the next generation and the next generation can go down some of the same roads, and I hope they can get some of the same spiritual awe that I got it. I sat out on sunsets and sunrises just happy, involved, you know. So I want to hear the birds. I want to breathe clean air. You know, I want to be able to eat fish that I catch that are game fish. You know, what a way to go, to take your kids out and go, oh, God, Daddy, look at that, caught me a nice fish. Don't eat it. God, don't eat it. That just is a no-no. And I don't care what political side you're on. It's beyond politics. It's just being a human being.